Welcome to our podcast from the Resilient Beekeeping with Varroa program and series. Today we're speaking with Emily Noordyke from the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. Welcome, Emily. You are currently the Technical Assistant for Plan B. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences and your history in the US?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me today, Bianca. This is great. So yeah, I have been working with Plan B for about a year and a half now, but I'm originally from the US and I started my beekeeping career with Varroa. So I understand that it's a big learning curve for sure. And I initially started in the honeybee nutrition research sphere, but have worked with other colleagues on Varroa-related research, and then also most recently, before moving to Australia, worked for the Bee and Farm Partnership. I was on the technical transfer team where we went to different regions of the US and assisted commercial beekeepers in monitoring for pests and diseases in their hives and just got a kind of an overall picture of hive health in their operations. And many of those beekeepers were migratory. They went to different pollination events all over the country. And so we were really there to help them look at whether their management techniques were working for them, kind of tracking the data. And a major part of that role was monitoring for Varroa before and after their major treatments and around their pollination contracts, especially after almond pollination. Yeah, a lot of the
Very
times
good.
we were monitoring for Varroa and helping with management strategies around that.
Fantastic. Well, that is the cementing reason why you're part of this pollination in Australia post Varroa for this particular interview. So yeah, we're off to a good start. We've got the right one here. We've got the right person in the hot seat. So what do you think? I'll go straight up to our first couple of questions. Let's get into it. So what does it mean for pollination in Australia and our agricultural systems? Those sort of impacts that we will be expecting and those challenges for bees, for beekeepers, and growers in Australia.
Yeah, so Varroa does add management challenges for sure. It adds some management hurdles. There's an expectation of increased labor and costs around managing for Varroa. And this will likely impact growers as well, because if beekeepers are having a tougher time and spending more money on management, then growers could have to assist beekeepers and potentially pay more for pollination or and we'll definitely get into that more in detail. But
Yeah. So there's sort of like this new, I guess you probably didn't see, we're giving away your age, but you weren't beekeeping in the US prior to Varroa arriving in the 80s or late 70s. So I guess you've seen some beekeeping now in your time in Australia. So there's definitely a change coming for us, but would be now the norm in America. I just wanted to say, like, I guess, they're feral bees in America. They mustn't be around. That's what we're expecting here. So in Australia, we've got some of the highest feral populations in the world of honeybees in our forests, and it varies across the country, but generally it's pretty high. What's your prediction for our feral populations? You know, that expected change that's sort of on the way.
Yeah, great question. So in the US and in many other places around the world, when Varroa established, we saw a great decrease in feral bee populations. So it's predicted that the same will happen in Australia. We're not sure what the timeline is going to be, but definitely expect to see some changes, in
Big
the
losses.
next few years. Yeah,
Yeah,
losses of the
yeah.
feral populations. Yeah, in the US, I think the only feral populations that do exist to some extent are Africanized bees in southern states, just
Okay.
because they are a little more tolerant. Not manageable because they're definitely
Yeah.
tough to manage, so it's not
Yeah,
not
I heard
a
we don't want to we don't want to go down that path, do we? We wouldn't
no, we
love that.
don't.
Wouldn't love that here at all.
Yeah, but yeah, in
Um,
general, the feral populations in the US are very low to non-existent now.
yeah, okay. So I guess that's going to start impacting Australian beekeeping because as the ferals start to diminish in the landscape, how do you think this will impact on commercial honey production? You can speak broadly, like I mean, this is serious generalization, we don't
Mhm.
really know the answer.
Mhm.
And then that loss of free pollination or the crop yields for those pollination dependent industries, because those populations of feral bees are currently potentially doing lots of free work. And yeah, the honey production, will that change, do you think? And yeah, what sort of other parts of pollination dependent industries do you think will have an impact?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, like you said, this is maybe a big prediction, but with a decrease in feral populations, there could be less competition for floral resources for commercial beekeepers. So potentially they aren't competing with those ferals anymore. They could see an increase in honey production, but I don't know how significant that might be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Right.
been speculated, but we really won't know till we know. But
Yeah.
it is something I've heard a little bit about, that there's
Hmm.
potential.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting to try to predict the future there.
I
But yeah,
mean,
then in
that might be the upside. If I can be generalizing on, there's a small potential upside,
hmm,
but then there's the other end of that scale for pollination dependency, that feral population decline is challenging for pollination dependent industries.
right, yeah, for the growers who have been relying on the feral populations for pollination and not necessarily going for a lot of managed pollination, yeah, they could see an impact on their crop yield. Definitely a decrease if the feral populations are gone, or at least, well, they decrease in the next few
Yeah.
years. They could see a decrease in their uh, crop yields.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so could you give us a little idea of the types of dependent crops that are using pollination services across the US, like that's quite established now? Um, yeah, established pollination services between bee industry and growers.
Yeah,
Like there's
the
food crops, but fodder crops too, animal production crops.
sure. Yeah. So the big one is almonds. So that is the major draw for beekeepers in the US in terms of a pollination contract. And almonds are very heavily reliant on managed bee pollination.
Yeah.
And then other ones include apples, pears, blueberries, um, carrot seed, as well as, gosh, in the Northeast, they do cranberries. Yeah, yeah, they will
Yeah,
go to
that's
alfalfa. Yeah, so
yeah,
definitely.
we have like a lot of beekeepers are doing seed pollination.
Hmm.
And some of those might also be food fodder crops for animals. So I know in several parts across Australia, after almonds, there's usually this flow-on effect of other crops that beekeepers go to, whether they're a food production for humans or alternate. So yeah, there's been lots of talk about apples and pears and changes in that environment, but also canola, seed canola crops.
Mhm.
That can be something that will change. And I guess some of those landscapes for pollination are typically using bees because they are a broad scale monocrop, which would probably lead to why they loss of ferals would increase their need. But we certainly know the big five, I guess, of almonds and blueberries and some of those already established here. but there will be some increases and there will be some changes. And I guess not to be ignorant that that's the future, the change in some of those dependencies for here in our country, I guess the increase that's going to kind of be on the horizon. I guess I'll go to our next question. It's really around starting to get into the managed bee space and away from the feral bee issues that we think will happen. And it's sort of talking to the data around losses of managed hives. And I've found a bit of information that talks about the losses around the world on average. That's difficult to translate into Australian context until we really know more about what's happening here and how that will take a little while. But in California, it's reported that they lost 75% of colonies in the third year post-Varroa of managed colonies. So that's a lot. To the contrary, New Zealand lost around 16%. And I'm not sure if that's in the first 3 years or not, but it's quite a long time after. Maybe 30 years they've had it in America, then New Zealand got it. So all up with the rest of the world's probably had Varroa for that length of sort of 50-year time frame. But do you think that will translate similarly here in Australia? I think maybe the education in New Zealand was helpful for them to have a less of an impact on managed colonies. Do you think that will take 2 to 3 years or so here till we start having that high risk of managed colonies being lost?
Yeah, that's a great question. It does sound like a lot of people seem to be saying and predicting that 2 to 3 years we're really going to start seeing impacts on the managed hive populations. I think Australia does have an advantage, potentially like New Zealand, in that we can really look to overseas experience and try to use that to
the best advantage that we can get. Yeah.
Exactly. Lessen the blow, hopefully. And of course, there are things we're uncertain of in the Australian context. So we'll have to adapt to that. So things like little to no brood breaks, which would decrease Varroa reproduction, those types of things. But one thing that I think could be really an advantage for Australia, and we'll see how this moves forward, is the lack of deformed wing virus. So deformed wing virus hasn't been found. It hasn't been seen, at least in samples that they've taken so far. So that virus is associated with higher losses of honeybee colonies, and Varroa just spreads it so well. It's very successful. So yeah, potentially, we're wondering if bees here in Australia will be able to tolerate higher Varroa loads because deformed wing virus isn't being spread around. However, there are viruses already present in the honeybee populations here, and Varroa is most likely going to increase the spread of those viruses. So we can't really predict at the moment how that could impact colony health and potential losses. So yeah.
So I guess we can probably just make a small assumption that it will eventually, in that 3-year time frame, we will lose, fair few of our feral populations. And I feel as though it's probably fair to say that the pollination dependent industries and the loss of managed bees in Australia will all kind of come to a point. And I think the benefit for pollination industry is a bit like us learning from all of the overseas experiences with, efficacies of managing Varroa, that pollination dependent industries have all this time to initiate some learning and upskilling of their growers. And it's a good thing that they have that time. And it will be an opportunity for them to understand that dependency that they're going to have potentially in the future. If we lose all those feral populations at that same time frame, we really want beekeepers to know what they're doing by then, and hopefully we'll lose less colonies of managed bees to be available to meet that need. I think they're going to come to the same point, is what I'm getting at. And I think one benefit is the time frame for pollination industries to kind of, as you say, soften the blow of the impending change that's on the way.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
So I guess the other part of pollination dependency and managed colonies is for beekeepers. We understand that the time in labour to manage bees is going to change with an endemic population of Varroa in Australia. And how that changes for pollination dependent industries is kind of complex in the way we could explain it to growers if they were listening to this recording down the track. How will it change? So do you think beekeepers will be more likely to sort of increase their hive numbers to overcome potential losses? Or do you think beekeepers are likely to reduce numbers of colonies? Because we know they're going to spend more time and more money on potential interventions. The labour will be a big part of that as well. Do you think, have you observed like behaviours in beekeepers that change because of Varroa that affects their numbers and their colony numbers altogether?
Yeah, definitely. And this is a bit of speculation, but I think initially beekeepers might be more likely to reduce their numbers as they're learning to adapt to Varroa and manage those increased costs, the increased time for managing Varroa. So yeah, I think that might be what we see initially here. I don't know what that was like in the US, like 30 some years ago. But what I've heard in the past is that it's almost harder to have that middle ground of hive numbers. So it's a little bit easier to either manage fewer colonies or really scale up to manage those losses, which scaling up a lot initially is difficult to do. But over time, that might be what we see. So in the US in the last few decades, operations have just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. So that really seems to help beekeepers manage their losses throughout the year. So in the US, the Bee Informed Partnership surveyed over the past 10 years and has seen, at least in the last year or so, that we have 40% losses year after year. This is between all types of beekeepers, but those big operations are really good at keeping up with those losses. And
so there's losses over winter, but then there is still maintaining the number of colonies.
Yeah.
So they're doing managing splits prior to the winter losses. Is that, yeah, that's how that's happening for people who perhaps maybe don't understand that it's not the entire overall number of colonies going down, because they're maintaining the number across the country, right? But they're just recovering and learning how to, make more bees up and accommodate those 40% losses.
Definitely. Yeah, I think we're even still seeing an increase in numbers finished hives in the US, but it is all about splitting heavily and making up those losses. They've gotten good at making up for those losses, basically.
That's what they say. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm hearing that from lots of different people that look, we can learn to do this. But beekeepers are really good at making up bees, and hopefully that becomes a better practice, and we can move through that process as an industry. I guess I wanted to push a quote that I've in the Resilient Beekeeping Project report that it says that you're quoted as saying, if you don't manage the mite, your bees will die. And I don't disagree with that. I've heard that from several people who know, very well about managing and living with Varroa. People from overseas and who've worked overseas or had bees overseas, might be just a recreational beekeeper who's lived overseas managing bees. So with what we think maybe is a 30% increase in the management cost. That includes labour and any interventions that a beekeeper might put in place, like a chemical or a synthetic or organic or a mechanical intervention for varroa managing. That's the prediction for us, the 30% increase in those costs. Do you imagine some beekeepers will be looking at the lowest cost of interventions as the priority for them at the start? I mean, regardless of a beekeeping business or regardless of if a beekeeper is, just keeping bees as a side hobby or a project on the side of their regular life, like a recreational. Do you think that beekeepers will pick up on some bad interventions and just to save money? And have you seen that? Have you seen, the implementation of, say, experimental chemical use that's bad for human health, bad for bee health? And what have you seen overseas that would have had better colony survival had they maybe incentivized a bit more of understanding colony numbers, potential costs, like a bit of a plan to manage those losses? Do you think that's something that you've seen, that people tried and failed?
Sure. Yeah, there's definitely experimentation out there. And it can be problematic. I think in terms of cost, it's really tempting for beekeepers to mix up their own miticides. So using the same active ingredient that would be on permitted label treatments, but buying that active ingredient themselves and mixing it into their own concoction and putting it on, soaking strips, soaking towels, and putting it in the hive. So they can, in that way, increase the dose. And it's just, so it's a recipe for mite resistance over time, because it's, increasing the dose. It works well initially, but over time, those experiments often lead to bigger problems like mite resistance, where the chemicals just don't work.
A non-controlled chemical experiment to do that would also risk that toxicity to honeybees when you put that application in place, right? So it might be very toxic to Varroa, but it's only this far away from being deadly to honeybees. And if people go away and, I guess, put some concoctions together, maybe that works for a little while. But the other thing is it might not work, and it might actually kill bees at the same time. And it might not be the time frame. You might not do it for a year and be all good. It might do it that first time and kill everything and suffer. So I guess you've seen that happens. I just wanted to go across that information because, people are going to start considering those risks, or at least understanding, it's going to cost me more to do this. Am I going to keep going? Am I going to have the same numbers? Am I going to change my management and try and, skimp and cut corners on costs just to be able to manage the same number of bees? Because I think some of the conversations we're having is that the number of colonies that, are productive, that people can have as an income, they'll change. They'll have to increase, but that'll mean that 30% increase in management costs goes with it. You've seen it. You've seen that unsafe to humans, that unsafe to bees, and the very big risk of resistance, which doesn't help anybody in the end, does it? It's a big no-no. So with that understanding of increase, for growers and brokers, and even if someone, say, an agronomy background or an agronomist in the future is listening to this, can we talk about the environment of a pollination contract, so a crop or a farm, from that beekeeper's perspective, where we mostly sit? We understand what we need for our colonies. The high density of colonies can be that unavoidable risk that we know we're facing during a pollination event. What are the impacts pre-Varroa that you can see from your time here in Australia, and your previous experience has involved only Varroa environments. But in that time you've been here, what are some of those pre-Varroa impacts that make pollination risky for beekeepers?
Yeah, definitely a good question. So those higher densities of colonies in one area within their foraging range can be risky in terms of disease spread. So if operations are dropping bees in similar in close contact, essentially,
Yeah.
the bees are more likely to spread diseases. So here in Australia, it seems like AFB, American foul brood, is one of the big ones beekeepers are concerned about getting. Well, in pollination, they worry that, maybe some other beekeepers in the area aren't being truthful about AFB in their hives, and they could pick it up. But this is true of, any disease. If, some stronger colonies are robbing, or, there's a lot of drift between operations, drift between colonies. Yeah, just in general, higher disease
Yeah.
spread.
Bees will travel. So beekeepers, putting numbers of hives in different areas of a farm, it might be unaware for some people down the track that if you're a grower or an agronomist, and you visit a farm and you're now, say we're 5 years down the track from now, and they're starting to get bees on their properties, they need to realize that there's a risk for honeybee health for every beekeeper that's on that site. And often, especially in almonds that we know of now, that there's beekeepers from all different regions that turn up on the same farm. So there's this intermixing of bees. And when you say bees interacting with each other, there's also this term in Australian beekeeping, and obviously it's around the world, that bees drift. And that means that they're accidentally going back to the wrong hive. And that can also be another beekeeper's hive. So if a colony has something like AFB, that drift means that it could go to someone else. And that's, for the people that don't do beekeeping listening, that's a bad outcome if hives that turn up at a pollination event are not healthy, because it risks everybody's health, and everybody then leaves the pollination event, and it might take a little while for someone to notice something's going on in their hives, and that can just have the flow-on effect of very poor colony health. And even poor hives turning up at a pollination event also impact the pollination efficacy of those hives, right? So you would have seen a bit of that in your time, that poor quality hives coming into orchards are less likely to do a good job. So it's good that brokers need to know, right, that bees are healthy, and the risks are managed in a certain way by everybody doing the right thing, and an understanding of what healthy bees look like and good pollination. What's going to change with Varroa now? If it's already somewhat risky to go to a pollination event, if an industry is going to start using bees more often in their operation to get a better crop yield, how does Varroa change those risks? Is it much different, or is it just another thing?
Yeah, it is another thing, just another pest that we are concerned about spreading between colonies. Oftentimes, and this is an established
Yeah. So
Varroa
there's a
setting that I'm
difference.
speaking on.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about the as Varroa's in this spread stage, and then
Right.
once it's endemic, because America is an example of endemic, but we're going to be in a bit of a, it might be here, but it might not be there, and people might travel from an area where Varroa is to an area where it isn't. Could you, yeah, that maybe focus on that and how that
Sure.
impacts?
Yeah, so early on, as Varroa is spreading in Australia, pollination events are definitely a risk for picking up Varroa and spreading it throughout the state more quickly, because beekeepers could be traveling from all over the state, maybe even interstate, to a big pollination event. And even if they didn't have Varroa previously, could be picking it up from beekeepers who do have it. And then they are going back to, on to the next event, either onto the next pollination contract or onto the next honey flow, and, way far away. And then Varroa is in those new places, it's just,
Yeah.
definitely an avenue for Varroa to spread more quickly across Australia. So definitely a risk. But in terms of when Varroa populations are more stable and it is
More
established,
endemic.
more
Yeah.
endemic, what we see in the US is that these pollination events are still just a means of spreading Varroa around more quickly. So if one beekeeper comes to a pollination event and has higher mite loads, maybe hasn't treated as recently, then that poses a risk to beekeepers who come in and their bees are, treated ahead of time and have lower mite loads. They can, again, through drifting, or maybe if those other colonies are really weak, strong colonies can actually go and rob other colonies and pick up Varroa from them. So it's just another
And
avenue of
it's
spreading.
small and big pollination events. Like even the smallest pollination situation where there's multiple beekeepers, even if it's not, say, our large scale Australian almond season, any pollination event or even any honey flow chasing, but certainly an awareness for, brokers and people on farms to understand if they're going to start using bees down the track, they will be, that there is some context to making farms good for bees.
Mhm.
What kind of beekeeper and grower behavior have you seen that, balances out the risks with the outcome of a well-pollinated crop?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Like contracts, really good contracts, or just like great conversation, great communication?
Yeah, it's all about building good relationships. And of course, that can take years. But yeah, between the grower and beekeeper, knowing each other's practices and how those practices will impact, and for the grower, having some way of vetting the colonies that come in. I mean, using a broker to secure contracts can help because the brokers are typically aware of a lot of the beekeepers that they work with and their practices, so that can help find, guess, good relationships. Brokers can help found those good relationships initially. And it's also about having a good contract in place. So be detailed with your contract to make sure that you're mitigating risks. Be very clear about what needs to happen during the contract, like where the bees need to be placed, when they need to be placed, um, what needs to happen if the grower suddenly needs to spray chemicals on their crop, and just make sure
Yeah,
that
like
you're
the beekeeper access, if they're there for a long period of time or a short
Mhm.
period of time, or if the crop is not really good for bees. We can
Mm.
see some crops are not entirely nutritious for honeybees and they can cause health concerns. And maybe rotation of hives is something that needs to happen in that contract. And access to farms and things is an important part of being able to manage the colony health. You
Mhm.
want the bees to be at the top of their health while they're in that environment. Can you talk about like risks that farmers or growers might need to start understanding, even agronomists, when they're going to start using bees now if they haven't before? The risk of chemicals on farm while bees are on site, and how that can be managed, or at least an awareness of the fact that growers already use pesticides and insecticides and fungicides and all sorts of things to get the best yields. Most of them, I'm speaking generally, there obviously are organic producers that might use different methods of pest management, but for beekeepers to be on farms now in the future with the Varroa situation here, there's going to be a bit of leniency, right? We're going to have to understand what chemicals we're using that affect bees and things around that. So I know in some crops, beekeepers request in their contracts that they are told about when crops need to be sprayed. And if their bees are on that side at the time, then that's really important. and also the timing of applications of chemicals. So would you have seen a lot of that happening, and what are the outcomes if that works, and what are the outcomes if it doesn't, the losses or the good outcomes for both sides?
Yeah. Yeah, again, that good communication is key around chemical use on farm. I think some of the major things that need to be considered is trying to apply pesticides or fungicides, those different chemicals outside of your pollination contracts, so before or after, would be ideal. If chemicals need to be applied while bees are on site, yes, definitely alert the beekeeper. But some practices to minimize risk to bees on site include applying the chemicals at night when the bees are in their hives, so they're not out foraging, and getting as I guess as big of an exposure to the chemical, and then also avoiding spraying on windy days, because that can cause pesticide drift and can definitely pose greater risks for the bees. Could lead to pesticide kills. So those are major ones. Another one to consider is if you're spraying, avoid tank mixes. So if you're mixing multiple chemicals at once, that can pose a greater risk for bees in the area, just because a suite of chemicals can be harder on the bees, basically. Sometimes interactions of chemicals can be acutely lethal, or even, more kind of have physiological effects on the bees that we might not even be able to detect initially. So avoiding the mixture of chemicals. We talk about it being a synergistic effect on the bees potentially. So that's another thing to consider.
Fantastic. That's great. I think we know from overseas experience too that honeybees are so much more susceptible to pesticides, and the impacts of pesticides on them with Varroa in the landscape. So that synergistic issue, that's really making it hard for healthy bees to do their job, and for beekeepers to take bees off farms and have colonies afterwards that are doing what, either the next pollination event or producing honey that, is another part of their income. I didn't realize the mixing. Obviously, I'm not a grower of any particular crop in a large scale, so that's some interesting different things. And I guess that communication about the different crop needs and the annual plan of how they manage those crops is probably important to consider if you're going to start thinking about making contracts, so that everybody's needs are sort of up on the table, and to time manage some of those things that can't be avoided as best as possible. That's great. I'm really so glad that I got you here to talk about some of these things. And I think chemicals on farms is something that's quite common, but it's not something that is acutely common in Australian beekeeping at the moment. So there's a really big change for us to understand. We're potentially going to start investing in chemical use in honeybees, and to know those other little bits and pieces around how we produce money and a business out of beekeeping. I guess I've got one last question to round it up. And I just wanted to see, I've been asking each of our interviewees the same question for the series, just to gauge, I guess, from your experience, where you can finish on a bit of a positive for our beekeepers listening, as it is learning lots and lots of stuff. So what advice have you got for Australian beekeepers who are at the same time learning and adapting through our new challenging phase of Varroa? How can we stay on course?
Yeah, great question.
Like what's your best, advice for us? I know we're going to be going through some tough times.
Yeah, it will be tough, but I think there's a lot of hope. Other parts of the world have learned to manage Varroa, and so it will be the same in Australia. I I think the bottom line is that education is the best weapon in our arsenal against Varroa. Just really having an understanding of Varroa biology and all of the different management techniques that can be used to keep Varroa at bay, keep the numbers low. That's important. And I would like to put an emphasis on integrated pest management as a technique. I think Australia has a really unique position in that we can use IPM early on as a method to control Varroa in a sustainable way. So for listeners who might not be super familiar with IPM, it's a way of using multiple management techniques, either a mechanical control, which might physically remove Varroa using a method. I won't get into all of it now.
Yeah,
Or
our next interview is going to be specifically on IPM. So it's great leading in. That's great.
perfect,
It
perfect.
has got
Or
great benefits because we're going to have
yeah,
different landscape. You know, we've got a different
yeah,
environment. We've got totally different seasonal conditions. And yes, so those mechanical choices could complement some of those inabilities. We don't want to just keep chemical treating. Yeah, that's keep going. I'm not going to interrupt you anymore.
no, that's
It's really
great.
it's really important, I guess, to get that education. Be open to changing what you're doing. Um, yeah, be aware that we might fail a little bit, but we do have this chance to sort of take all the good bits from around the world, like IPM, and understand it fully, so that we can get across the next phase as quickly and as easily as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there will be some trial and error, but that's how everyone will learn, and hopefully using the best knowledge that's already out there will help the process.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you, Emily. Thank you so much. You've been really valuable. And I'm sure we're going to see more of you around in the bee space in Australia. So thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Bianca, for the great conversation.